Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the Digital Commerce and Consumer Protection Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce. And before we get started, just let everyone know there's the Environment Subcommittee is also running downstairs, so we'll have members coming in and out from downstairs from that subcommittee meeting too. So I, again, want to welcome you to the subcommittee, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. And again, good morning and welcome to our witnesses, and we thank you for being with us today to discuss the proposed reform of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. CFIUS was first established by the executive order by President Ford. Over the years, the committee was codified and its members expanded based on input from this committee under both Republican and Democratic leadership. CFIUS is tasked with reviewing mergers, acquisitions, or takeovers of U.S. businesses by foreign persons to see if they pose a threat to our national security. If CFIUS determines that a transaction does threaten national security, it can negotiate changes to the terms of the proposed deal. Alternatively, the committee can recommend that the president block a proposed deal. Until recently, presidents have generally not found it necessary to block a proposed foreign purchase of or controlling interest in U.S. assets. However, in the last 6 years, presidents from both parties have blocked a total of four proposed transactions. The increase in presidential action to stop foreign takeovers of American companies is one indication of how the world has changed. Foreign direct investment in the United States in 2016 doubled over the previous 10 years. In addition to an increase in monetary investments, foreign investments have also taken new forms, including the joint venture. While more foreign investment in America is generally a good thing, for example, Honda has a large presence in Ohio. Concerns have arisen that some investments could be the work of foreign governments that would want to advance, want to access the advanced U.S. technology or infrastructure. If America's international competitors lack the ability to develop their own technology, they may find it easier to buy it by acquiring an American business, or they may seek to purchase critical U.S. infrastructures as a way to harm American interests. CFIUS is the organization charged with examining who is investing in national security related to U.S. companies and why. Today, we are going to examine whether CFIUS has the proper tools to do that job, what tasks are already assigned to other government bodies, including export control agencies, and what steps are already being taken through regulation to reform CFIUS. The most important job of Congress is to ensure the safety and security of our nation. Whether through the CFIUS process or other government programs, it is our duty to be vigilant for the American people. Our security, both economic and national, secures the freedoms that help Americans thrive. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on their thoughts on the reform processes and proposals for CFIUS, in particular H.R. 4311, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2017, and what other consideration policymakers should keep in mind during this debate. I want to, at this time, yield to the ranking member, the gentlelady from Illinois, the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My opening comments will certainly reflect what you have said as well. American ingenuity attracts investment from around the world. That investment can bring much needed capital to American companies, but foreign interests can also use investment to threaten our national and economic security. Congress has instructed the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to review mergers and acquisitions by foreign investors for potential national security threats. It has been a decade since the last major CFIUS legislation. We are more than due for evaluating how CFIUS is operating. In 2016, the stock of foreign direct investment in the United States totaled $7.6 trillion, and foreign investors spent more than $365 billion acquiring U.S. companies. Given the enormity of that investment, we must consider whether the current safeguards for our national security and our national workers, our nation's workers are sufficient. State-owned and state-affiliated enterprises in China have sought U.S. intellectual property through mergers and acquisitions, as well as joint venture agreements. Current CFIUS review is inadequate to capture the various ways a foreign interest may try to access sensitive American technologies. Today, we will be hearing about several bills to reform CFIUS. H.R. 4311, the Bipartisan Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, would expand the investments covered by CFIUS's review to protect critical technologies and infrastructure. Congressman Ed Royce and Elliot Engel, the chair and ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, have introduced H.R. 5040, the Export Control Reform Act, to control the outflow of military and dual-use items. Finally, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro has introduced H.R. 2932, the Foreign Investment and Economic Security Act, to expand CFIUS's review to greenfield transactions, which are new investments as opposed to acquisitions. Her bill would also ask CFIUS to evaluate not only national security risks, but also economic, public health, and safety risks. Our hearing today occurs within a broader debate over trade. President Trump has placed tariffs on steel and aluminum, and the United States is currently renegotiating, it could be today, I hear, we may get some sort of an announcement on NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. Any new NAFTA deal must include strong labor protections for workers in this country as well as for workers in Mexico and Canada. Last week, I was among the 107 House Democrats who sent a letter to the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, emphasizing our opposition to legislation in the Mexican Senate to weaken labor standards in Mexico. I am encouraged that the legislation has now been tabled. I believe that Americans benefit from trade relations that are fair. Americans are increasingly aware that corporations have manipulated U.S. trade policy to the detriment of workers and consumers. As we examine our trade policy, we want to keep fairness to American workers and consumers front and center. Corporations have used trade agreements to fight against countries' labor and environmental laws. We should be fighting for fair trade agreements that protect workers and our environment rather than encouraging a race to the bottom. National security is an important consideration as we review foreign investment in the United States, but I hope we also spend time today on other risks that unfair trade practices pose to this country. I look forward to hearing from our two panels of witnesses. I appreciate your being here today, and I want to thank Chairman Letta, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady yields back, and the chair of the full committee, the gentleman from Oregon, is not here. Is there anyone on the Republican side that would like to claim his time? Seeing none, and we haven't had, I saw that Mr. Green had checked in, but we'll go ahead and include with member opening statements at this time. And the chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. And again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being with us today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give 5-minute opening statements, followed by a round of questions from the members. Our first panel of witnesses for today's hearing will include the Honorable Heath Tarbert, the Assistant Secretary for International Markets and Investment Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury, and the Honorable Richard Ashew, the Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And again, I thank you both for being here. And Mr. Tarbert, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Latta, Ranking Member Schakowsky, Vice Chairman Kinzinger, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of FIRMA and about CFIUS more generally. The United States has always been a leading destination for investors. Alexander Hamilton argued that foreign capital is precious to economic growth. Foreign investment provides immense benefits to American workers and families, such as job creation, productivity, innovation, and higher median incomes. At the same time, we know foreign investment isn't always benign. On the eve of America's entry into World War I, concerned by German acquisitions in our chemical sector, Congress passed legislation empowering the President to block investments during national emergencies. During the Depression and World War II, cross-border capital flows fell dramatically. And in the boom years of the 1950s and 60s, investment in the U.S. was modest compared to outflows. During that time, foreign investment also posed little risk. Our main adversaries, the Soviet Union and its satellites, were communist countries that were economically isolated from us. But when the post-war trend changed in the 1970s, CFIUS was born. The oil shock that made OPEC countries wealthy led to fears that petrodollars might be used to buy strategic U.S. assets. In 1975, President Ford issued an executive order creating CFIUS to monitor foreign investments. Then, in 1988, a growing number of Japanese deals motivated Congress to pass the Exxon-Florio Amendment. For the first time, the President could block a foreign acquisition without declaring a national emergency. For the next 20 years, CFIUS pursued its mission without fanfare. But in the wake of the Dubai Ports controversy, it became clear that CFIUS needed greater procedural rigor and accountability. In 2007, some of you helped enact FINSA, which formally established CFIUS and codified our current structure and process. Well, now we find ourselves at yet another historic inflection point. The foreign investment landscape has shifted more than at any point during CFIUS's 40-year history. Nowhere is that shift more evident than in the caseload CFIUS now faces. The number of annual filings has grown within the last decade from an average about 95 or so to nearly 240 last year. But it's the complexity, not simply the volume, that has placed the greatest demand on our resources. In 2007, about 4% of the cases went to the more resource-intensive investigation stage. Last year, in 2017, nearly 70% did. This added complexity arises from a number of factors: strategic investments by foreign governments, complex transaction structures, and globalized supply chains. Complexity also results from the ever-evolving relationship between national security and commercial activity. Military capabilities are rapidly building on top of commercial innovations. What's more, the data-driven economy has created vulnerabilities never before seen. And I know the gravity of this last point isn't lost on any of you. Protecting against the disclosure of American sensitive personal data lies at the core of this subcommittee's work. In several cases we've seen even over the last year, the company being acquired had access to significant amounts of sensitive information capable of exploitation by state actors. Similar sensitivities can arise because a company has concentrations of data regarding American servicemen and women, private information such as medical records, or simply personally identifiable information on such a vast scale that the national security concerns are too large to ignore. New risks require new tools. The administration has endorsed FIRMA because it embraces 4 pillars critical to CFIUS modernization. First, FIRMA expands the scope of transactions potentially reviewable by CFIUS to include certain non-passive investments, joint ventures, and real estate purchases. These changes lie at the very heart of CFIUS modernization. Right now, we can't review a host of transactions that present identical concerns to those we regularly examine. Second, FIRMA allows CFIUS to refine its procedures to ensure the process is tailored, efficient, and effective. Only where existing authorities, like export controls, can't resolve the risk will CFIUS step in. Third, FIRMA recognizes that our closest allies face similar threats and incentivizes our allies to work with us to address those threats. And finally, FIRMA acknowledges that CFIUS must be appropriately resourced. Since testifying in the Senate in January and the House in March, I've been meeting regularly with members of Congress, the business community, and other stakeholders to hear their views on the bill. As a result of these meetings, we've been working on proposed technical amendments to ensure that FIRMA is even better tailored to address jurisdictional gaps while also encouraging investment in our country. There's only one conclusion here: CFIUS must be modernized. In doing so, we must preserve our longstanding open investment policy. We must also protect our national security. These twin aims transcend party lines, and they demand urgent action. I look forward to working with this subcommittee on improving and advancing FIRMA. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. And Mr. Ashew, you are recognized for 5 minutes. And again, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and the members of the committee for having us here today. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today regarding CFIUS and to share the perspective of the Department of Commerce, not only as a member agency of CFIUS, but also, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned in your opening statement about export control agencies, and we'll bring that perspective to our testimony today as well. Within Commerce, the International Trade Administration and the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, play important roles in the Department's review of CFIUS matters. BIS is the administrator of the Export Administration Regulations, or EAR, is the regulatory authority for the licensing and enforcement of controls on dual-use items, which are items that have a civilian end use, but can also be used for a military or proliferation-related purpose, and also includes less sensitive military items. The export control system administered by BIS is a process that, like CFIUS, involves multiple agencies, primarily the Departments of Defense, Energy, and State. We work closely with these agencies to review not only license applications submitted to BIS, but also to review and clear any changes to the EAR itself, ensuring that the export control system is robust. The interagency licensing process also takes into account intelligence information to assist in the analysis of the potential threats posed by those proposed exports. Further, the export control system benefits from close cooperation with our international partners through 4 major multilateral export control regimes focused on national security as well as missile technology, nuclear, and chemical weapons non-proliferation. Through these regimes, the United States and our partners coordinate on which items and technologies merit control and how those controls should be applied. The EAR's authority covers an array of in-country transfers of technology, as well as exports of goods, software, or technology to foreign countries. For example, the EAR regulates the transfer of controlled technology within the United States or abroad to foreign nationals under what we call deemed exports. It differentiates between countries that range from our closest allies to embargoed nations, thus allowing the export control system to handle technology transfers under different licensing review policies depending on the level of concern with the recipient country. The EAR also includes lists of end users of concern that trigger extraordinary licensing requirements, as well as prohibitions of certain end uses. The export control system is also highly adaptable to evolving threats and challenges. BIS is currently reviewing control levels and procedures to specifically address such threats from adversary nations, as well as their interest in emerging critical technologies. Our export control system includes aggressive enforcement capabilities as well. BIS's special agents are located across the United States and overseas, with a primary focus on identifying violations of the EAR and bringing to justice domestic and foreign violators. Recently, BIS, in conjunction with other federal law enforcement agencies, announced a prosecution against 2 individuals conspiring to violate export control laws by shipping controlled semiconductor components to a Chinese company that was under a commerce license restriction known as the Entity List. The export control system and CFIUS are complementary tools that we utilize to protect U.S. national security, with CFIUS addressing risks stemming from foreign ownership of companies important to our national security, and export controls dealing with the transfer of U.S. goods, technology, and software to foreign nationals, regardless of the mode of transfer. As with the export control system, it's also crucial that CFIUS remain adaptive to current and evolving security challenges. The FIRMA legislation introduced in the House and the Senate would, if enacted, take several important steps in this direction, especially the provision requiring mandatory filings for certain transactions involving foreign government-controlled entities, as well as the provision which would facilitate greater cooperation and information sharing with our allies and partners. Such international cooperation is an essential part of our export control system and would benefit CFIUS as well. In sum, the export control system and CFIUS are both vital authorities and complementary tools that the United States relies upon to protect our national security. Strengthening CFIUS through FIRMA, while ensuring that CFIUS and the export control authorities remain distinct, will enable even stronger protections of U.S. technology. The Department of Commerce looks forward to working with the committee and the bill's co-sponsors on this important effort, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Well, again, thank you for your testimony, and that will end our presentations from our witnesses, and I will begin the question and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Pardon me. It's allergy time in Washington. First, this is a question for both of you. What are the administration's views on the proper relationship between export controls and CFIUS? Mr. Harbert, would you like to start, or Mr. Ashew?
Sure, I can start. I think Assistant Secretary Ashew said it right. The administration believes they are complementary and mutually reinforcing tools of the United States government. And so the stronger export controls are, the better that it makes CFIUS, and vice versa.
And I would certainly reiterate that, and the fact that the not only is CFIUS in need of modernization, but our export control authorizing legislation as well. And right now, there's independent efforts to do both. That is very, very important, because as we modernize one, it's important to modernize both, because they really are knitted together and rely upon each other to be effective.
Well, let me follow up with that then, Mr. Ashew, if I could, because do current legislative proposals create a clear distinction between CFIUS and export controls, and if they don't, should they?
The current legislation, the CFIUS legislation.
Right.
Yeah, the latest, and I don't want to pretend to be an expert on what's going on in the committees that are working on the legislation, but as we understand it, the latest draft does do a very good job of not only drawing the line, but leveraging each other. There's an acknowledgement that the goals of FIRMA need to be accomplished with several authorities, and export controls is specifically carved out and reinforces the relationship that the two have.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Tarbert, how has foreign direct investment in the United States changed since the last time this committee considered CFIUS legislation in 2006?
Sure. We're seeing, I mentioned a few points in my opening testimony, but just to give you a little bit more flavor on that, the rise of state-owned enterprises, particularly for certain companies, from certain countries that are buying strategic assets as part of an industrial plan, and in some cases that industrial plan involves civil-military fusion. And so there's this inflow of state-owned enterprise money that is sort of government-backed money that are not purely financial investments, but are purchasing U.S. businesses with more military and strategic goals in mind. The other thing that's changed is that, to go back to this committee and what you all are really specialist in, is the vulnerability side. So the sort of the sources of the funds coming into the United States and why people are investing. But then there's also the U.S. companies. There's much more. We live in a big data economy now. And so when we're looking at a particular U.S. company, a healthcare firm, for example, or even an internet servicing firm, the data on U.S. citizens is much greater than it was 10 years ago, and certainly 30 years ago, when the actual jurisdictional provision of CFIUS was created. So it's been 30 years since CFIUS's actual jurisdiction has been revisited.
Thank you. Secretary Ashew, do the current export controls administered by your department adequately prevent the transfer of sensitive goods and intellectual property?
They do, but they need to be utilized aggressively. This is not a one-and-done scenario, as we've learned not only on the CFIUS side, on the export control side. Bad actors seek to evade current restrictions, and they do this all the time, and the volume of this activity is also going up. So the authorities, while they need to be updated, are certainly able to deal with the threats to the technology transfer, but they need to be utilized aggressively.
Could you, when you talk about utilize aggressively, how would you define that?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the things that's important about the export control system is we do have enforcement, and we need to utilize our enforcement. And so I referred to one example in my opening statement, but that is something that we're relying on Congress to help us make sure is resourced properly, because at the end of the day, this comes down to having the right people doing the job. But it also means making sure that we're staying ahead of the technologies that are targets. And we're living in a world now where emerging technologies, which is really the strength of the U.S. innovation base, we're very excited about the technologies that are coming online, most of them for civilian purposes, but which could have national security implications. And so we need to be aggressive about identifying and potentially controlling that category of technology.
Okay, my last 20 seconds, not to be picking on you, one last question. In your testimony, you said that, however, we're concerned that the 25% threshold in FIRMA is too high, and that you might encourage that Congress consider a lower threshold. What would that lower threshold be, in your opinion?
So we've identified 10%, which is similar to what the SEC uses to identify their definition of control. Our view is from an export control perspective. The wider the aperture that proceeds through CFIUS is an opportunity for the export control system to understand and examine those specific transactions for export control purposes. So we think the overall system benefits from having that wider aperture.
Okay, well, thank you very much. My time's expired, and the gentlelady from Illinois, the ranking member of the subcommittee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
So many questions. I'm going to try and get through some of them anyway. So I'm interested in hearing from both of you the issues of staffing and resources. It's my understanding that the number of investments or transactions that CFIUS is reviewing is already, you talked about that, how many more there are, and that FIRMA could require CFIUS to review even more transactions. So if we could start with you, Secretary Tarbert.
Sure. So in order to do this, we'll need resources, particularly FIRMA. I mean, we're committed to ensuring that the resources are there so the cases can be reviewed adequately for national security purposes. One thing that FIRMA does is it has a special funding mechanisms which helps ensure that the resources are there. It also has a special, the legislation would not go into effect until there's a certification by the Treasury Secretary that the new regulations and resources are in place. So absolutely, resources are a very important part of this.
How many transactions per year does CFIUS review now, and how many do you expect it would be required to review if the bill became law?
Right now, we had a little under 240 cases before. We think that we don't know with exact certainty because the bill is changing. It'll certainly be multiples of that, but we don't know exactly how many because the bill is changing, and we also want to make sure that the regulations really pinpoint those transactions that are most likely to give rise to national security concerns.
And how many staffers work for or are assigned to the committee, and how would many more staff, how many more staff? So you can't really tell how many more would be required if the law
Not at this
passed.
time.
Okay. Okay. Secretary Ashu, did you want to respond?
Sure.
To the issue of resources?
Part of the reason why it's difficult, there's actually a good reason why it's difficult to forecast, and that reason is certainly in the case of commerce. The majority of people who work CFIUS cases are also working licensing and other export control related matters. So we're leveraging the expertise of both. We've got a cadre of about 30 engineers and scientists that help us understand the technology in question. And those are people who would work on both. The caseload will go up, there's no question, but I don't think it'll be necessarily a one-for-one increase because we'll continue to leverage the overall organization to support what we're doing.
So, Secretary Tarbert, we've been, this subcommittee and the Energy and Commerce Committee has been dealing with the issue in pretty high-profile hearings on security, data security, privacy, that kind of thing. And the things that you were saying really concern me because then what are the guiding principles? The United States of America has very few real regulations when it comes to data privacy and security. Europe has come up with a new regime on how to do that. But so what guides you on whether or not the data that these investors want to have or do have is protected, or how do you balance it?
So it's a great question. So there's probably a whole other data protection debate that you've raised about that. What CFIUS looks at are specifically, are there national security concerns arising from the vulnerabilities of the target company? So when we do an assessment of a transaction, we look at the threat, which is an intelligence community analysis of the foreign acquirer, and then we look at the vulnerability, which is essentially an assessment of what the target company has in the U.S. And then we put those two together and say, if the threat meets the vulnerability, what are the potential consequences? So if we have a foreign acquirer...
Well, these are all ifs, but have you actually enforced some? Can you tell me about
Absolutely. So we see cases where the foreign inquirer there may be concerns that they could take Americans' information and share them with their state authorities in a way that could have intelligence community effects. And so in some cases we would require mitigation. that effectively doesn't allow certain people from the foreign acquirer to have access to Americans' information.
And how often does that happen?
It's happening more often than before, but again, it has to arise to the level where we need to say there's actually a national security concern. But it's arising more often than certainly 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago.
And what kind of company would that be?
Could be any particular company.
What company has there been?
They're in various industries, healthcare, for example, where healthcare information is particularly sensitive, and it can be in the financial services industry as well, where we've seen cases where, again, there's lots of personal data and financial data on Americans where we're concerned that it could have national security ramifications.
Thank you. I'd like to hear more about that, but I run out of time.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, the vice chair of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Appreciate it. Obviously, there's a lot of questions we have. This is an extremely important issue, especially when you deal with the economy. We obviously want to make sure we're protected. At the same time, anytime we make changes in the way our economy works, it could have implications that we know nothing about. And so part of you being here is extremely important for that. Mr. Tarbert, in your testimony, you emphasized the gravity of potential vulnerabilities arriving from the digital data-driven economy that we live in. Can you explain how countries are exploiting this and how you believe that modernizing CFIUS will help address those concerns?
Yes, there's only so much I can say because some of that's classified as to what how countries may be exploiting the vulnerabilities. But I think if you think about a company that contains lots of personally identifiable data, personal healthcare data on individual Americans, one can easily see that if that information got into the wrong hands, particularly if those individual Americans work in sensitive U.S. government positions, that a foreign actor could exploit that.
Okay. Mr. Ashu, in your testimony, you state that our export control system and CFIUS are complementary tools, as the chairman talked about, that we utilize to protect our national security. Given that they complement each other, are there any gaps in the way that they interplay?
I think any gaps that might exist are not gaps between the two. I think that FIRMA is addressing gaps that need to be addressed in certain transactions. That will benefit the export control system. And I think it's also important, to illustrate why these two need to be complementary. If we're concerned about a certain technology, oftentimes the concern will be over the nature of the transaction under which that technology will be transferred. CFIUS is very good at understanding and blocking or mitigating those transactions. Once that occurs, though, the technology still exists, may belong to several companies. In fact, usually does. And so if we have a concern over the technology that was resident in that transaction, we want to make sure as an export control agency we follow it and control it wherever it goes. So the
Kind of cradle to grave, in essence.
It really belt and suspenders, whatever you want to use. It's very important for us to follow the technology of concern wherever it goes. And I think the changes that we're talking about, if there are gaps, those will be addressed in FIRMA, and that will then help the export control system be more robust.
And then let me ask you, how does coordination with other agencies such as DOD occur with respect to the evaluation of potential military application of a civilian technology?
So the export control system is founded on an interagency process. And so the agencies that I mentioned, energy has national security role, it protects the stockpile, defense, state, all are the member agencies of that review export control licenses. That includes an escalation process, meaning if one agency has a concern that does not feel it's being addressed, they can raise that up to the assistant secretary level all the way up to the cabinet. So we can really drill down into the issues that are of concern. I'd also like to expand on that internationally. We have a similar process where we work with international allies because, again, we're talking about evasion. In cases where the adversary nation wants to obtain something from the U.S., can't get it, doesn't do us any good to control it if they can get it from Europe or somewhere else. So we have a number of ways to work with our allies to control technology. And FIRMA, again, acknowledges the need to work internationally as the export control system does, again, creating more complementary natures.
And then do you think, for both of you, do you think that CFIUS is capable of addressing emerging technology concerns given how rapid innovation is occurring? And what changes do you think are necessary to better position it to do so? I mean, you know, in a month, we're going to have technology we don't even know exists today.
I'd just say that there needs to be a process where emerging technologies are identified and considered and made part of the CFIUS review process, or certainly the export controls. And so the newest, we've been working a lot on that process in the bill with members of Congress, with the committees of jurisdiction, to make sure that we have such a process and that process keeps up.
Sir, this is a critical issue for us. We're spending a great deal of our resources and focus on adapting to the trend you just identified. There are, we have technical advisory committees that include private sector individuals and companies that are those early stage innovators. We were relying on them. In fact, we reorganized them around emerging technologies as one of many efforts. With more time, I'd be happy to fill you in more on what we're doing to tackle that.
Cool. And Mr. Chairman, to be an example for generations to come, I yield back with time remaining.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill contemplates increasing CFIUS scrutiny of certain transactions that involve critical technology or critical infrastructure. While I understand the purpose of CFIUS is to consider each transaction in light of national security, I'm interested in how labor issues are considered. I understand that the Secretary of Labor is a non-voting member. What is their role in the committee?
Sure. So if an issue raises to the level of national security, it will be considered. And as you say, the Secretary of Labor has an observer role. And so therefore, if there is a case, so normally what happens is that if there is a case involving a company where, let's say, the Labor Department is primarily involved, whether it's in a set of ERISA funds or other things, a labor union of some sort, where there's a foreign acquisition there, then we would often ask that cabinet secretary to sit as the co-chair of the case.
Okay. Can CFIUS consider whether a transaction would strip the U.S. of these good, high-paying jobs or pose threats to the health or environment of Americans?
Right now, CFIUS is focused solely on national security. So if there's an issue where it rises to the level of national security, it would be considered. There are a number of other tools the U.S. government has to address some of those issues, as well as some of the issues that you raised, Ranking Member Schakowsky, about unfair trade practices and things. But for now, CFIUS is just focused on national security.
Well, and I know, and I have a very urban area and an industrial area in Houston. If a foreign company comes in and there is a labor bargaining unit, by federal law, that they continue that agreement. Does CFIUS take that into consideration, or is that Department of Labor responsibility?
I believe that's the Department of Labor. We look solely on, we're set up solely to focus on, does this pose a national security concern to the United States?
Okay. The issue is focused on foreign investment. Obviously, we'd like to have foreign investment in our country and discuss. Either of you, do you agree that the U.S. needs to support R&D and infrastructure spending? I mean, that ought to be a no-brainer. I think all of us do. What are you doing to push the administration to make such investments?
Do you want to?
Well, sure. So I come from the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is dedicated to national security issues within commerce, but we're a very small bureau and a very large agency that is focused on ensuring that we are putting pedal to the metal on innovation, research and development. R&D in the United States exceeded $500 billion last year, which is an all-time high. Most of that is private, and so we want to make sure that we continue to encourage that private investment.
Mr. Talbot, some have recommended that a net economic benefit test should be added to CFIUS review procedures like those that some of our allies employ. Would you support such a test being mandated, or if not, why not?
Sure. So the administration's position is that CFIUS has always been designed and should continue to focus solely on national security. Okay. That said, there are other tools available to address economic issues, and so the 301 investigation is something that I think goes to many of the concerns that you've raised.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Secretary Ashu, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Rhymes with cashew, if you like cashew.
Oh, Ashley, okay. Very good. When CFIUS law was last amended in 2007, does the term national security include homeland security when analyzing the national security implications of a transaction? And if so, does this include issues related to state and local enforcement agencies, which are often on the front line of homeland security?
Yes, sir, it does.
It does?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And as Secretary Tarbert, how does CFIUS seek out the input of other federal agencies not included on the committee, such as FTC or other regulators, who review separately and enforce competition and consumer protection?
Sure. So in many of the cases, you brought up the FTC and also the FCC. There's often a regulatory process ongoing. So if a company is buying another company, CFIUS will be running in many cases in parallel to whatever separate regulatory process there is. So sometimes we will coordinate with them if they spot a national security issue that we haven't spotted. That's rare because we use the intelligence community and the Defense Department. We will work with them. The other thing we do is sometimes we'll see a case involving an agricultural company, for example. And there, the Secretary of Agriculture doesn't technically sit on the committee, the Department of Agriculture, but because they have unique expertise, we will invite them in to help co-chair the case. And so that's happened a number of times.
Thank you very much. Again, for Secretary Ashu, how does the department ensure that the Commerce Control List is keeping up with emerging technologies that we might not want to fall into the wrong hands?
Again, this is something we're devoting a great amount of energy to. Emerging technologies, that's not a new thing. We've always had the concept of new technologies that have yet to be subject to the Commerce Control List. But as we alluded to earlier, it's the volume. And again, this is a good trend. We're seeing amazing innovations occur. I've already referred to one change that we made structurally, just to our technical advisory committees. But we've also established a certain control number, a control area within the Commerce Control List specifically designed for emerging technologies. And what this does is allow us to place an immediate control on a technology that may be so new that is yet to be considered and that we're not clear on what the national security implications might be. This way we can control it immediately, and that then triggers a process, an interagency process that was referred to earlier, that will allow us to work through under certain time constraints, so we're not going on forever, and adjust the control appropriately, and then take it to the multilateral regime, so we're doing it internationally. This is an area that's going to get much more attention based on this trend in the large volume of emerging technologies.
Very good. It sounds like you've been very proactive.
Devoting a lot of time to it, sir, yes.
I appreciate that very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Tarbert. Are we looking also, obviously you look at governments and investment with direct connections and stuff, but as you know, around the world there are individuals who also have maybe nebulous connections to various governments. Is that the type of thing that would trigger a CFIUS review potentially as a specific individual? Tell me what you can tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. No. So we take that when someone files with CFIUS, the intelligence community does something called a National Security Threat Assessment. And that National Security Threat Assessment looks at the acquirer as well as the individuals behind the acquirer to get an understanding of who they are. At the same time, within the Treasury Department, we have the Office of Terrorist Financing and Intelligence, which runs a check through our systems on the individuals as well, whether they've been involved in anti-money laundering or there are any issues there and their potential connections. So that's a very thorough part of the process because I think as you're intimating, we could have a company from a country who's an ally but have bad people at that company.
That's my point. You have people that have maybe nebulous connections to other people that aren't necessarily on our side on certain issues.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other thing is can you briefly describe maybe the chain of command type decision-making process at you know, with CFIUS, because obviously the ones that we hear about are in the newspaper. The president himself or herself, whatever the case may be, has made that decision. But obviously, that is kind of unusual, probably.
Right.
And whatever you can say publicly about the process, because I think from a representative's perspective, the more that the American people know about a process and the better understand it, the more people like me are able to help you reform the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in the wake of the Dubai Ports controversy, FINSA was passed. And so that statute essentially lays out what the process needs to be. And so the case comes in, we assign it to case officers, and members from all of CFIUS's member agency, case officers, work on that particular case. Ultimately, a case cannot be cleared unless a Senate-confirmed official, at least one, signs off on the case. There are certain cases that require higher-level sign-offs at the deputy or even secretary level, and those involve ones that go to the investigation stage, as well as when the acquirer is a foreign-controlled entity, foreign government-controlled entity.
Right, because I think that's an important concept for people to understand, that the only cases you're seeing in the newspaper that the president, him or herself, has decided are not the only cases that you all are looking at. And sometimes I think that, you know, that impression is created where, you know, where people are saying, well, why did the president make that decision? And to know that there was a more complicated process that actually ramped up to that level, I think is important.
Right, in less than 1/10 of 1% of the cases, the president blocks. So there's a lot of cases where
Right.
we review them, they either get cleared or we impose mitigation. So people only read the
Right.
newspaper story, but they're
Yeah, and I think also people have the impression that sometimes it's a political decision, not a national security decision that a president, him or her, has made, and that's just not the case. Last question, Secretary Tarver. In your testimony, you touch on the gaps in jurisdictional authority to protect national security. Obviously, those are probably commonly known gaps by people that are trying to get around your process. Can you describe what those might be and how H.R. 4311 might help to resolve those gaps?
Sure, and those gaps in many cases have been brought to our attention because the parties themselves have said, well, if you don't approve our transaction, we'll restructure it this way to get around it. 3 gaps are essentially these. Number one is our real estate in close proximity to military bases and other sensitive U.S. government. The statute allows us to look at mergers, acquisitions of a U.S. business, but if it's vacant land, that's not a business. So there have been situations where if it has a windmill on it, we can review it. If it doesn't have the windmill on it and they put the windmill on it after they buy it, we can't review it. Second area are non-passive investments. So these are investments that come below the level of control, but they involve a board seat, they involve the ability to come on the premises, to get all the information they need, and many foreign actors have found that that's even better than even getting control because it's cheaper, but they get what they need. And finally, there's the JV provision where they take essentially, they replicate the business in the U.S. overseas, and therefore it's not a U.S. business anymore.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ashew, in general, the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000 prohibits unilateral sanctions, restrictions, or conditions on the export of key humanitarian products such as food, medicine, and medical devices. Is it your sense that medical device products should generally be excluded from proposed CFIUS reform definitions, in particular the terms critical technologies and emerging technologies?
I'd say that is definitely an issue for the export control system and is one that we have in consideration. But as far as definitions within CFIUS, we believe that those definitions should sync up just as the two systems should sync up. And so, I mean, this is a reasonable policy. It is primarily an issue in the export control system. I don't know that it's one that's really emerged on the CFIUS side.
Okay. Is there any reasonable argument that medical device products, including the associated intellectual property, are sufficiently relevant to national security to justify subjecting transactions involving such products to CFIUS jurisdiction?
It is possible. It's possible. I don't have a crisp answer for you because I don't have any direct experience in that case, but it is certainly possible.
Okay. And do you have any suggestions as to how to ensure CFIUS legislation accounts for such a humanitarian exemption?
I'm sorry, one more time, sir.
Do you have any suggestions as to how to ensure CFIUS legislation accounts for such a humanitarian exemption?
Yes, and again, it gets back to the theme we've been repeating. That is the sort of thing that the Department of Commerce would bring to the table, as well as potentially other CFIUS member agencies, HHS, for example. That's why the interagency process in CFIUS is so important. We rely on the expertise where it belongs in the various agencies.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for being here. Before I got on Energy and Commerce back in December, I chaired the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And during my time there, we had hearings on the Venezuelan situation, and especially with their energy company, PDVSA. And during that time, PDVSA pledged their stake, 49% of Citgo, to Russia for a loan of $1.5 billion, something like that, I believe. Rosneft is the company, the Russian oil company, that basically took the collateral. And if Venezuela defaulted on that loan, that would effectively give Russia and their energy company, Rosneft, a 49% stake in Citgo, an American-based refinery company and oil producer. We sent a letter, Ranking Member Albio Sires and I sent a letter to the Secretary on April 6th of last year, asking you guys at CFIUS to look at this transaction and with the possibility of blocking Russia's ownership of not a majority stake, but a dang near close majority stake in a huge American asset of Citgo refinery. So let me ask you what the status of that investigation is, and where we may go from here. What's the next step?
Sure. So I can. The statute prohibits us from talking about specific cases in a public setting. So I will give you, if you're amenable to it, I will give you a confidential briefing to your office whenever you'd like. But let me just say this. The point that you're raising is an important one, because right now the statute allows us to look at anything where there will be control. But for a non-passive investment that doesn't pass that threshold of control, particularly for a critical infrastructure asset, CFIUS does not have jurisdiction. So that was one of the things that we looked at very carefully in crafting the provision of FIRMA, to ensure that transactions similar to the one that you described would absolutely be within our jurisdiction.
Thank you. I'm going to take you up on that briefing.
Absolutely.
I'm no longer chairman of that subcommittee, but this is an issue that I've followed for a long time. Situation in Venezuela, but also Russia's involvement in energy and guaranteeing loans and assets that are American assets. Let me just ask you one more question in the time I've got. Assistant Secretary Talbert, in your testimony you touch on gaps in your jurisdictional authority to protect against national security concern. What are these gaps, and does H.R. 4311 help resolve those?
Yeah, so the three gaps are land that's not a business, but nonetheless is near a sensitive military installation of some sort or other national security installation. The second would be the one that we just talked about, where potentially you have a ownership stake that doesn't technically meet the definition of control, but nonetheless has a lot of influence, has access, has the ability to get information and to influence the decisions of the company. So that's a non-passive investment. And then the third are when someone essentially tries to replicate a business or a core business capability overseas. That's not a U.S. business, and hence CFIUS doesn't have the authority. FIRMA addresses all of these things, and it's continuing to evolve in a manner that addresses them with more effectiveness.
Right. Well, thank you.
you.
Mr. Chairman, because of the jurisdictional boundaries, this committee may not have been aware of the situation I was talking about with Venezuela and PDVSA and Rosneft and Citgo. I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record copies of the letters we sent to CFIUS.
Without objection.
Thank you. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Thank you for holding a important hearing. A couple of topics I wanted to touch on. So first, gentlemen, this is about state-owned enterprises. There's been a bit of discussion as to whether Congress or CFIUS should make a distinction between foreign investments made by private persons or firms as compared to those made by firms that are state-owned or partially state-owned. During one of the hearings at a Financial Services Committee, members commented that it really did not matter in the case of China because even private firms are influenced by the Chinese government and would readily make investments or disclose information upon request of the Chinese government. So curious as to your thoughts, either one of you. Can you share your thoughts as to whether we should be making such a distinction or whether China is a problem kind of no matter what? Mr. Tarbert.
So thank you. Thank you, Congressman Kennedy. For purposes of state-owned enterprises, we think there's a mandatory declaration requirement for those because we think that certainly with state-owned enterprises, there's a clear nexus.
Yes, right.
And therefore, we think that we should be notified of those transactions. When we go through the threat analysis and the intelligence community does the national security threat assessment, they look very carefully at the history of a given company and its potential connections to the state. And so you're exactly right that with respect to certain countries, particularly those with doctrines of civil-military fusion, the line between state-owned and private becomes blurred, and we take that into account.
And certainly that's an issue we deal with constantly in the export control system. And the system is designed to allow us to examine whether or not that civil-military integration, which is a factor, certainly in China, and in fact is common to the countries that we find ourselves spending most of our time with, Russia, Iran as well.
And I assume then, gentlemen, it would be kind of a similar analysis with regards to investments in a venture capital fund or private equity fund in terms of foreign investment going into, you know, a partnership with a VC that started buying up potentially strategically important early stage companies.
If the venture capital firm itself, so the question is the venture capital firm itself a foreign firm? If the answer is yes, then that would be within our jurisdiction. If it's an American firm and the foreign investor just has a passive LP interest but doesn't control that, then that's out of our jurisdiction.
Okay. Do you believe that CFIUS can place appropriate conditions on the investments that could critically limit Chinese or any other government their access to critical or emerging technology when investors are in Chinese firms? So similar, I guess, follow-up between the two.
Yes, and we do it nearly every day. Thank you.
Pushing a little bit more on the passive investment side, some concerns have been raised about a provision in the bill that would limit investments even when they are passive and the investor would not have control of the U.S. company and would not have a say in those decisions. Under such a case, does the committee have a way to ensure that the relationship does not change after a review takes place? So, for example, if a foreign investor started to demand to see certain IP, from what or how at least I understand it, the relationship would already be established. So could such a case get before CFIUS on a secondary review?
That's a great question, and so we thought about exactly the point that you made, and so in the FIRMA bill, there's an additional basis of jurisdiction when an investor's ownership changes, materially. To fall into one of the jurisdictional categories that exist.
And forgive me for not knowing, how would you be notified if that investor's relationship changes?
Well, if it's a state-owned enterprise, there would be a declaration. Okay. But otherwise, CFIUS remains a voluntary process. So we have methods and capabilities of sort of monitoring the landscape. But as a technical matter, it could occur. Now, the sort of the ability that we have is if it does occur and they don't notify us, then we have the ability to go in and reopen that transaction at any time.
Okay. Anything to add, sir?
Only that if there's a case where there's a technology transfer concern in what you're discussing, the Commerce Department will often place an additional licensing requirement on the companies in question as an important reminder that they're obligated to not transfer that technology, not only to a foreign national, but the re-export of that as well. So again, we keep track. This is how we leverage the CFIUS process to make sure we're keeping track of the technology.
Thank you both. I'll yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. Thank you guys for being here. And I have the question, these two questions are for both of you. One, you mentioned earlier today that about the volume of reviews. Specifically, if the current form of legislation is enacted, how many additional transactions will CFIUS be required to review, and can CFIUS handle that increase?
So I can answer it. We don't know with exact certainty because the bill continues to evolve.
In current form.
In current form, we're still, because then there'll be regulations additionally that redefine it. We think it would be multiples of what we're currently reviewing, and we would need the resources to be able to staff that. But more importantly, we don't think that the per case officer volume would remain the same, that ratio, because one of the things that the bill does, which I think is critically important, is for those transactions that really don't require an immense amount of government resources, there's a streamlined filing process. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when our ally buys an American company, there's very little national security issues. We can process those a lot quicker. Today, if you want to file before CFIUS, you have to fill out a 50 to 300-page form listing all this stuff. And so for things that are more likely to be cleared, a much shorter form, more efficient and effective, will actually reduce the time spent on each particular case. So we think that's really helpful to modernize it.
Because the volume goes up, then there'll be tools to moderate it, as you said.
Absolutely, and this would not go into effect. One of the key provisions in the bill says that nothing will go into effect and become live until the Secretary of the Treasury signs a certification saying the resources and the regulations are in place. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, the argument there is, well, that could take a while. It could take a year. What about stuff we're seeing today that's a concern? It also allows us potentially, if passed, to have a pilot program. So if we know there's transactions out there of a certain type that we want to stop the day the bill is passed, mm-hmm. we can issue an immediate sort of regulation to address those while getting the resources in place for the larger jurisdiction.
I guess that's another question, too, as we're looking at H.R. 4311. And if the reviewable transactions dramatically do increase, I know you have the streamlined process, but if, let's say, it dramatically increases and it is an issue, what do you think that'll do to foreign investment in the U.S.? Will it deter it or hamper it? Or?
We don't think so, because America still remains the preeminent destination for investment, and the more we're able to protect those companies, to protect national security, in the long run, the more attractive that's going to be for investors. Okay. But obviously, the reason why CFIUS is chaired by the Treasury Department is we're particularly aware of wanting to attract investment to the United States. And so in 1988 and 2007, we've always got that balance right, and we want to continue to get that balance right by protecting our national security, but obviously continuing to attract foreign investment.
Okay. Do you have any comments on
yes,
the last two questions?
I might add, it's worth pointing out that even absent FIRMA, the caseload under CFIUS has gone up year on year fairly substantially. So the resource issue is one that we've been grappling with and will continue. I don't necessarily, and Secretary Tarbert might agree, we don't see that steady increase slowing. Mm-hmm. This is being driven by, obviously, some trends, regarding, nations that see a benefit in pursuing this.
And one final point, as a Treasury Department, we don't really like to spend a lot of money. We like to collect it. But I think our view on this is that,
like business, you want more money to come in than go out. Yeah.
Yeah, but well, no. Given the amount of money that we spend on the defense of this country, to spend whatever we need to spend to have people reviewing these critical transactions to ensure that our technological edge isn't lost. In many ways, it's an insurance policy that's well worth the money.
Okay, thanks. I have a question just for you, Secretary Tar, or you could either one, but can you tell us in general, and obviously in unclassified terms of what you can share, what is the greatest threat to the U.S. that CFIUS is tracking right now? And for instance, is it the transfer of technology, foreign control of infrastructure, or something else? I guess I did a town hall recently and somebody stood up and said, the hardest question I had to answer was, of all the questions I had to answer, and they were from left and right, were, what keeps you up at night?
The truth is all of the above. Mm-hmm. That we're seeing threats and vulnerabilities, obviously sort of state-owned enterprises as well as other companies that are working in close contact with their states and trying to acquire companies that are critical to our technological edge. That's important. But on the vulnerability side, the personally identifiable information, there are a number of other things we're worried about, and we're always worried about infrastructure. The purchase of infrastructure. So I'd say, unfortunately, it's all the above. Every day I come in, I see sort of a new threat or a new vulnerability, I feel.
All right, thank you very much. My time has expired, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you both. You know, this question of imposing a big responsibility without providing the resources to get the job done is of concern to me. So one of the questions that's brought up in this bill is whether there's some ways to streamline without relinquishing review. And one of those ideas is to have the bill apply only to a limited number of countries, or in the alternative, have a large number of countries listed that are not of concern and they'd receive a safe harbor. I guess I'm looking for your reaction to that, because we could over time have a list of countries that would shift. You know, it might have been Japan 10 or 15 years ago, whereas it probably would be China now. So I'd ask you your thoughts about this. Is this a practical way to try to relieve the burden without sacrificing safety?
Sure. So the bill chooses the second alternative in what's called sort of the good guys list. It doesn't choose a blacklist, and the reason is because if you start blacklisting certain countries, it can easily be evaded, particularly in the acquisition context. So if you had and then you run into the problem. Well, then if you're a blacklisted country, and then how many investors in a particular entity do you need to make that entity blacklisted, and then we end up sweeping in our allies. And to your point, the threat changes over time. And the vulnerabilities remain the same. So it's very well possible that we have a U.S. company that's so important that even people from countries that we wouldn't necessarily blacklist still requires review and some kind of mitigation.
I see.
But the good guys list is important because there, our allies are facing, in many cases, the exact same threats that we are. And so the idea is that if we can get them to work with us to create similar investment screening regimes, that would actually save us potential concerns, because
So a similar protocol.
Exactly.
For them and us, because we have a unified interest.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
And if I might add, one of the benefits of CFIUS is that the member agencies bring their expertise and authorities to the CFIUS table, and the export control system is very list driven. We've got end uses and users, countries of concern, and I can tell you that lists come with a cost. It takes a fair amount of effort to maintain those lists. So rather than have multiple and perhaps overlapping lists, it's useful, I think, for these agencies to bring them to the table, and Commerce certainly does that in the CFIUS context.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, I was at another hearing downstairs, and so I missed a lot of the testimony that perhaps you've given. But one thing that I did hear as I came in was earlier you made some point that CFIUS is a voluntary program, and that concerns me a little bit, a great deal actually. And I'm hesitant because we went through our classified briefing, and then I had another classified briefing on another situation that had to do with CFIUS. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to stick to we can have from open source. Should we be making it mandatory? I come from the construction industry, 50 years in construction. You can't start a project without getting your permits for water, sewer, air, archaeological digs, environmentals. But yet we allow a project to begin. Someone, foreign entity, can invest in a project, and it may take you a while before you become engaged, and by that time it's too late. The information on energy transporting data is already out there and it's gone. Why is it voluntary, and why why would we not make it mandatory that they have to first check the box that they've approached CFIUS for a preliminary ruling before they proceed?
Great. So the first question, why has it been voluntary? And it's been voluntary since the start of it.
That doesn't make it right, but go ahead.
Yeah, and I think the thought there is that because CFIUS has the ability then to address the transaction, to potentially unwind the transaction,
After the fact,
that's enough to get people to file. Now, that said, the point you're raising is an important one. And for certain types of transactions, our view, particularly those by state-owned enterprises and also by particular types of technology, it's so important, just as you said, that we want to get a declaration in advance of that transaction so we know about it. And so the bill actually does that. The bill has a certain provision in there that there are mandatory declarations, in some cases for state-owned enterprises.
So will under this legislation, will someone that is trying acquiring an energy company, energy transmission company, will they'll have to announce that they're going to do this?
Well, right now, the bill requires declarations for state-owned enterprises that have some kind of substantial interest, and it may be 25, it may be.
I don't.
But if
I don't need that.
Yeah.
I don't need to have. If I just have a seat at the board. Right. Without any investment in that, if I get a seat at the board, I've got all the information, access to all the information I need. How are you aware of that?
So right now we're monitoring some things, but the bill would provide us with the authority. It doesn't mandate us to do that, but would provide us with the authority to say that in certain types of transactions, like the one you announced, you have to get a declaration before CFIUS before you can engage in that transaction. And so during the notice and comment period, we will be soliciting, if the bill passes, be soliciting views of what are the kinds of transactions, to your point, that are so critical and important, we don't want to be learning about them after the fact, that we want an advance declaration before.
Is there any protection in this legislation that, because the technical information, understanding how our utility markets operate is instantaneous, and by that virtue, it's after you're coming in is after the fact trying to address that. So how do you will this legislation prevent that transfer of information to without an investment? That's just merely a seat at the table. Are you going to be able to prevent that from happening? Because it happens in an instant before you're aware of it.
Yeah, to be frank, it could prevent it in certain instances. It may not prevent it in others. And so there may need to be additional legislation. It may not even require a board seat. Someone could just walk into the energy company, get to know the CEO, and a relationship starts. So it sounds like for that specific instance, we just deal with foreign investments of various sorts, that there may need to be added protection under some other area of the law.
So let me ask you, you just offered to do another classified. I'd like to follow up on the conversation you and I had last week, and so we can see where we might be able to go with this.
We are planning that, actually. I think we've got it. We're working to schedule that, the one specific to your state.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
And you know what he's talking about. Okay. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the Health Subcommittee of the E&C, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today. I also thank the subcommittee for putting together the classified briefing that we had on this subject. It was important, and I'll just ask, if I ask you a question that really should not be answered in an open setting, I will accept your deflection on that. I was here in the United States House of Representatives when Dubai Ports World got all the headlines, and most people didn't know what CFIUS was before then, and then of course everybody knew and became an expert on CFIUS. But what many people didn't know, and I didn't know at the time, is that this participation in this process is largely voluntary. Is that correct? And just as a matter of procedure, a notice which is given to you to answer a possible question, that how does that arise? Where do those notices come from? Other companies make those notices, or the company that's involved makes the notices?
Normally, the purchaser and the acquirer and the target company, the people doing the business combination, will come to CFIUS. Oftentimes as they're getting into the initial stages of planning the transaction, to tell us about the transaction and to get the notice started. They'll send us drafts back and forth of the notice, and we'll work with them to complete the notice, so then we can deem it accepted.
So that's part of their due diligence in doing the merger and acquisition background. Does it ever come to your attention from another source? Will someone else say, hey, this is happening and I wonder about it?
It does, and we have members of the intelligence community that are sort of, and other resources, but that's one of the things that I think this bill acknowledges, that we also need to have resources devoted to scanning the investment landscape for things that are not notified to us. So every now and again, we will get wind of a particular transaction that wasn't notified to us. We will look into the matter and in some cases ask the parties to file. If the parties don't want to file, or for some reason we don't think they'll be cooperative, we have the authority to actually issue the notice ourselves and start the case.
Just as a general matter, of the number of notices that come to your attention, are all of them investigated, a portion of them investigated, a large portion, a small portion? Could you quantify that?
Yeah, normally not many at all I'm sorry, investigated. There's a technical definition of investigation,
Okay.
which means the second phase, but I'd say all of them we look at and we determine whether there needs to be a filing. One of the things that FIRMA does, which makes it a lot easier, is because the filing costs a lot of money.
Sure.
It's 50 to 300 pages, and so for, let's say, a Canadian company buying an American company where there's not likely to raise any national security concerns, the parties will often say, this is what we're doing here, do we really need to file with you? We have to then say, well, we can't tell you not to file, but based on what you're saying and what we know about the companies, there may not be a national security concern, but that's difficult. So one of the things that FIRMA does is it creates the declaration where they can actually file a short version of that doesn't cost as much money, but we can then review that and determine whether we want a full notice or whether we have enough information to say that transaction's okay.
Well, under the current regime, are there any particular countries that when you list out the number of countries that are investigated or where you have notices that you're investigating, do there tend to be a preponderance of countries or is there a single country that is identifiable as this is where we spend a lot of our time?
What I can tell you is in those cases where we've reached out where there hasn't been a notice and a transaction has occurred, and we've either asked the parties to file, required them to file, or filed a notice ourselves to get it started, those cases have involved recently China and Russia.
And just of the transactions involving China, how many are allowed to proceed? Can you quantify that? Is there a percentage? Is it a lot, a little, all of them?
It's a substantial number, but a number of them, there's proceeding without mitigation, there's not proceeding, and then there's sort of proceeding with mitigation, where the government requires certain things to happen before that transaction can go forward.
Now, you may have already answered this, or you may have been asked this. I'm not sure if I understood or heard the answer. Is this a two-way street? U.S. involvement in other countries, is it blocked from time to time?
Well, it is. In some countries, U.S. investors are blocked regardless of national security. There are simply investment caps that don't allow our companies to invest in other countries. But that's more of an economic issue than an issue. I'm not aware of any situation where, for national security reasons, another country has blocked an American acquisition of one of their companies.
For economic reasons, when the president talks about he wants trade to be fair and reciprocal, is this one of those areas?
That would be potentially one of those areas, and I know that the Treasury Department and other government agencies have talked to different governments about, if we allow your companies to invest here, why are you preventing our companies from opening their doors in your country, or requiring that our company needs to form a joint venture with one of your nation's companies, that if we're going to allow investment in our country, why don't you allow our companies to go and do business in your country without imposing constraints on them? But that's an economic issue.
Yes, sir.
And sir, if I might just add, the concept of CFIUS is still fairly unique in the world. although we are seeing the EU and Japan and other allied countries establish similar procedures. We generally think that's a good thing because this is, again, a national security review, and to the extent we share national security goals, it's helpful to manage the foreign direct investment.
As far as the economic goals, I may follow up with you, Mr. Talbot, just because that is of interest to me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good morning to our distinguished panel. Both the Treasury and the Commerce Department maintain lists of prohibited persons and nations for purposes of trade and sanctions. Gentlemen, do you believe that these lists are effective in identifying the entities that pose threats to American interests?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
And do they provide a model of how CFIUS should view certain types of investment? For example, should CFIUS have a list of nations that will draw special scrutiny?
On this, we don't think so, and the reason is that we want to be able to review all transactions involving foreign investors where relevant, and each transaction is looked at specifically for the threat, the vulnerability, and the consequence. So there's an intelligence analysis of the particular acquirer, and so you could have a situation where you have an acquirer from an allied country, but the particular individuals within that are not necessarily friendly to U.S. national security interest. And so our view is that if we've never maintained a blacklist, so to speak, for particular countries, but since every transaction undergoes a very thorough intelligence analysis, the kinds of issues that you're talking about are always unearthed.
And so if I might, Commerce, through the export control system, does maintain a multiplicity of lists. It can be individuals, companies, technologies, end uses, end users. And Commerce, as one would hope, we bring those to the CFIUS table.
Mm-hmm.
So the experiences and knowledge that we have get brought to the CFIUS table, and that way we're not having to overdo it on the list side.
Thank you. Obviously, foreign direct investment has historically been a tremendous boon to our economy. Does the administration seek to ensure that any reforms to the CFIUS process do not create unnecessary hurdles for legitimate and beneficial direct involvement?
Absolutely, and that's why the Treasury Department is the chair of CFIUS, because it recognizes that we're looking at protecting our national security while at the same time maintaining an open investment environment. So while the FIRMA bill would increase the jurisdiction to certain types of transactions that have been avoiding review, at the same time it has a number of measures to modernize the process and to streamline it a bit for those transactions that are least likely to raise national security issues.
Thank you.
Yeah, and sir, where there's a technology transfer concern, we spend a lot of time really drilling down to what actually matters from a national security perspective so that we're not over-controlling and being overly restrictive.
Thank you, and thank you for your distinguished testimony. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back 2 minutes.
Well, before the gentleman yields back, would he yield?
Oh, I'll be happy to yield to the chair.
Well, no, thank you very much, because I'd like to follow up on a question that the gentleman from Texas asked and that came back. How often is a company or companies not cooperative with you when you want to get with them, and then all of a sudden they say, we're not going to cooperate?
It's very rare. Because CFIUS has the ultimate power to unwind the transaction, impose other things, and in some cases impose fines if there's a violation of a mitigation agreement, most companies seek to comply and work with us.
But you say most. Okay, all right. Well, thank you. The gentleman yielded back, and now yield back his time. And we want to thank you very much for testifying before us today. It's been very, very informative. We appreciate all that you do out there to help keep things straight for Americans, and especially when it comes to our security reasons. So we really appreciate your testimony today and all that you do. So thanks for being with us today.
Honored.
And so that'll conclude the first panel. And we'll get ready and have the second panel come before us.
Freezing in here.
Humid.
They really ran out of air conditioning.
Fine.
Thank you.
See you again.
Those guys are good. That was very interesting.
Do you have any idea who's going first? I don't know. Nope.
We'll find out. It'll be a little adventure.
We know by height. How about lack of hair? I think the person with the least hair should go first.
Technology side, the rest that they have.
Nice to meet you.
Communications.
Kevin Wolf.
Yeah, I think we testified at a similar hearing several years
endlessly.
ago. Yeah.
I just testified at a similar hearing 2 months ago. Yeah. I know. And now we're back down to the 2. I'll be right back. You know, if they drag me out of here while you're gone.
About 7 years. And before that, I was there with Linda Sanchez and Molly Duncan.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah. Well, now there's only one, but there was 2. So Loretta was the elected first. Loretta's now gone.
Honey, I've decided to put our retirement.
Yeah, yeah. They both have really, really good personalities. Very likable.
But it just all depends on the cycles. You know, I don't know from the primary maybe age until I think I lived my
Oh my. Yeah.
So it always comes down to.
What was your district? R plus what? What did Trump take it by?
You know what? See, I'm always careful about that because my lifetime, my dad was in the states that were born back in '56, and then so he was elected in '58, which was a terrible year.
No, if time.
This is why I live in.
I'll try to make this.
Exciting is good. Exciting is good.
Are you learning? So am I. It's my life's work.
Usually I don't do that.
That's on purpose anyway.
I'll try to stay ahead of my legacy.
I'll give you the summary tonight.
It's remarkable. Yeah. So I just say, I tell folks, don't even look at 2016.
Wow. That's interesting. That's interesting. Oh, I got a neck ache. What's going on? Well, if you hear when I get down, you're here. If you're not.
These mics sometimes don't.
No.
I'll turn these off.
Boy, how do I clear out? Must have all been the government people. Well, good morning. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming before the subcommittee. And again, we do have the other subcommittee running downstairs, so we do have members coming in and out during the hearing. And if I could, I'd like to introduce our second panel. The Honorable Kevin Wolf, partner at Atkin, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and former Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the United States Department of Commerce. Welcome. The Honorable Clay Lowry, Managing Director at Rock Creek Global Advisor and former Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at U.S. Department of Treasury. Ms. Celeste Drake, Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist at the AFL-CIO. Thank you. And Dr. Derek Scissors, the Resident Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And again, we want to thank you for being with us today because this is a really important subject. And Mr. Wolf, if you are recognized for 5 minutes. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman.
As an opening note, the comments I make today are my own views and are not behalf of anyone else.
First, before I begin, a compliment, as I've been following this FIRMA and CFIUS reform discussion. It's been a genuine, nonpartisan, good faith, regular order, civil, spirited public debate over
We can change that.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do. This hearing has been too straightforward. Let's see if we can raise it up a little bit. No, but no, seriously, these are legitimately difficult issues, and on difficult national security and economic security issues where bright lines are hard. And so, in fact, just a summary of where the debate really is. It's sort of between, and apologies for overgeneralizing, two camps, two very nonpartisan, good faith camps. There is one view that believes that CFIUS should have substantially expanded jurisdictional authority over far more transactions going in and out of the country to address evolving and emerging threats, particularly with respect to strategic acquisition from China of emerging technologies. Technologies evolve quicker than law or regulations can. Commercial transactions are very creative and more creative than the government can quickly understand. And on the other hand, and so therefore we need substantially more authority to be able to metaphorically look in every box going in and out of the country and decide whether, if in that box there is a transaction of concern, technology or PII or other types of activity of concern. And then the other camp does not deny that underlying threat, but says that before the government uses this extraordinary authority to impose additional controls on otherwise commercial transactions, that it should do the hard work first to identify the particular technologies and threats of concern and tailor the scope of the new authorities accordingly so as not to discourage investment. Because fear and uncertainty about what would be controlled discourages investment in the United States. The U.S. is an open investment culture, and for which there are great benefits to foreign direct investment. And so that's really what the debate in FIRMA is going back and forth. In my prepared testimony, I lay out some detail about the benefits of foreign investment and the issues with respect to the strategic plans from China, but I also lay out the questions to be asking when considering any changes to CFIUS. And the first question is, does the statutory authority exist in some other area of law to address the issue through a regulatory or process change? And then the second question is, would what the threat is that you're trying to address be better addressed more directly with fewer collateral consequences by another area of law, such as the export control system, trade remedies, government contract issues, intellectual property protection. And then the third question is the threat that you're trying to address or the issue that you're trying to solve, can it be addressed through more investment? Simply internally in the government, for example, in identifying more non-notified transactions to have more and deeper robust review of already filed transactions, or to be able to have more staff to monitor mitigation agreements, which are alterations of agreements thereafter. And if the answer to any one of those questions is no, then that's the sweet spot for reform. The area for which I'm the particular expert in, given my background, is with respect to the issues pertaining to technology transfer. And one of the threats identified in the previous panels and in general is the identification of and the control over technology that is being sought, that is emerging, that has dual-use implications, both commercial and other activities of concern. And my main theme is that with respect to efforts to control outbound investment, to please remember that there's an entire area of law, the export control system, which Secretary Ashu spoke about so well, that exists explicitly to do that, to identify and to regulate through an interagency process for national security purposes technologies of concern without imposing unintended collateral burdens on foreign direct investment, which we want to encourage. So I'm here to answer your questions about anything involving CFIUS or export controls or how they could or would work better together. And with that, I'll stop and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lowry. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on CFIUS and the modernization efforts underway. I'd like to, in general, I support FIRMA, but I would like to point out what I consider to be several key shortcomings in the current bill, particularly from the perspective of someone who had to implement the major reform of CFIUS that happened about a decade ago. Before I discuss these issues, however, I did want to say just a few words about CFIUS that goes beyond what Assistant Secretary Tarbert had to say. The easiest way to understand it is to know what its mandate is. And that mandate is to ensure national security while promoting foreign investment. It is not solely about protecting national security. And the reason for this is because welcoming foreign investment, in fact promoting foreign investment, is part of our national security. It's core to our economic growth, it's core to our increasing productivity, and it's core to creating jobs in this country. There was an earlier discussion about whether it should be a voluntary process. The reason it's a voluntary process, in many respects, is because of that issue. There's usually over 1,200 or 1,500 mergers and acquisitions that happen in the United States every year. Most of them have exactly nothing to do with national security. If we had a mandatory process, we would have to be investigating all of those. The CFIUS is exactly what you said. It's a committee. It's an interagency committee that investigates cross-border mergers and acquisitions that could put our national security at risk. Mergers and acquisition parties file with CFIUS, and so CFIUS determines whether the acquirer will gain control in the U.S. business. And then it does a three-part analysis as Assistant Secretary Tarbert laid out. The history of CFIUS is that it addresses complex transactions under very tight timelines in an orderly process that protects classified information and proprietary information very well. While most transactions don't raise national security risks, as I just mentioned, those that do are addressed because CFIUS has extraordinary powers to investigate, to mitigate, and, in very rare circumstances, to recommend to the President to block a transaction. The FIRMA bill, I think, does a good job of modernizing CFIUS and does a good job of filling in some of the gaps that were mentioned earlier. My worry, though, is that the legislation that we saw back in November is that portions of the bill use vague language, duplicate existing export control authority, and will be overly burdensome for both the private sector and the government. There's a substantial part of this bill that transforms the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States into a technology control regime in which there isn't a merger, there isn't an acquisition, in fact, there isn't even a foreign investment into the United States. In this scenario, CFIUS would go from reviewing approximately 200 transactions a year to several thousand. If this expansion is truly necessary for our national security and cost is the only issue, then by all means, let's find a way to pay for it. But this expansion is not driven by national security. Instead, it would be the needless result of a bill that is too vague and too duplicative, rendering it practically impossible for CFIUS to accomplish the work it has been tasked to do, and that is so vital for our U.S. economic and national security. We've just heard from Assistant Secretary Tarbert and Anna Hsu that the administration has recognized some of these concerns and is making a serious effort working with Congress to fix the bill. And this trajectory, in my mind, is very positive, and it suggests that we may actually find a way to modernize CFIUS, make it implementable, and improve our national security. If we don't fix it, though, I fear we will not enhance our security, we will harm it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And Ms. Drake, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Latta, Ranking Member Schakowsky, members of the committee, good morning. Is it still morning? Good. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of the AFL-CIO on the critical issues of foreign investment and job creation. I've submitted written testimony for the record and will highlight just a few key points here. The AFL-CIO and its affiliate unions support investment that creates good jobs. In determining the impact of foreign investment on U.S. security, we must recognize that our economic and national security are intricately linked. America's economy is really the source and foundation of our national security. And that's also the source of the AFL-CIO's interest in efforts to update and improve the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. At the end of the day, for us, it's a jobs issue. As you know, the U.S. is a premier destination for foreign investment. In comparison to other countries in which investors are required to create joint ventures for nearly every investment or pressured to transfer important technology or intellectual property, the U.S. has a very open system. And we must make sure that that openness does not become a weakness, allowing jobs and critical technology and know-how to bleed away. While foreign direct investment can contribute to the creation and maintenance of high-quality jobs, we cannot assume this is a given. Some foreign investors may seek to drive U.S. competitors out of the market or to transfer valuable technology, equipment, and intellectual property overseas, taking jobs with them. State-owned and controlled enterprises in particular may not invest with a goal to operate in the U.S. for the long term, but instead merely to acquire strategic technology for their home country that could in the end jeopardize U.S. security. Because of these risks, we have long supported updating CFIUS. CFIUS's current charge is too limited. It reviews mergers and acquisitions, but needs broader authority to address new and evolving acquisition strategies and vehicles. It cannot review new or greenfield investments, and its definition of national security is too narrow. Some of these shortcomings are directly addressed by the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA, which we believe will benefit America's working people. FIRMA balances open investment with important national security considerations. FIRMA will allow CFIUS to respond more effectively to efforts by China and other nations to buy technological and military components of the United States. Importantly, it will update the definition of a covert transaction, require filings for certain investments by state-owned enterprises, and ensure that mitigation agreements are monitored. Accordingly, we support FIRMA as a needed update that recognizes the complex business structures and fast-moving technology development of the 21st century. However, in our view, FIRMA does not address all of CFIUS's shortcomings. America's working people have additional concerns. We would expand CFIUS's ability to review greenfield transactions and to consider the net economic benefits of any transaction. By limiting greenfield reviews to those in proximity to strategic installations, as FIRMA does, we may miss certain predatory investments or the attacks on our companies piece by piece rather than wholesale. The Tianjin pipe facility provides a case in point. It's a greenfield investment that we wish we knew more about. If Tianjin uses its own inputs made in China with illegal subsidies or sold at less than the cost of production, Tianjin could harm U.S. businesses that make those same inputs, costing jobs, wages, and perhaps whole communities. We could get at those things with trade remedy law, but not once Tianjin is producing here in the United States. And by failing to review economic impacts, we may miss the forest for the trees, allowing investments that drive down wages or leave the U.S. with fewer high-value jobs in the long run. Trading partners such as Australia and Canada already require foreign investments to undergo such a review, and cases like the 1990s Magnequench acquisition demonstrate that not all foreign investment creates good jobs. In sum, we look forward to working with you to advance FIRMA, to improve CFIUS, and to promote the growth of the American economy through investment that creates high-wage, high-benefit jobs. I thank the committee for its time and would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Oh, thank you for your testimony, and Dr. Scissors, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My written testimony presented China facts to show part of the context for the CFIUS reform discussion. Sorry, I apologize. I can't believe people don't hear me anyway. But to show that my written testimony presented China facts to show the context for the CFIUS reform discussion, I'm going to go straight to the punchline here. If the amount of money tells us anything, Chinese technology acquisition is not done primarily in the United States. So if you just restrict Chinese investment in the United States, you are not going to block Chinese technology acquisition. You're going to do very little, in fact, to block it. To protect national security, the United States must be able to regulate certain businesses overseas, and particularly businesses involved with China. That's what the facts say. It's not an easy thing to do. I'm not arguing that it's easy, but that is what the facts say. On the flip side, the business community's objections are right that you can restrict investment in such a way that you deter beneficial investment, so legislation has to be as narrow and clear as possible. So I'm going to talk about the security requirement and then suggest some ways to make sure that HR 4311 or any modification of it does not or does minimal harm to foreign investment. It's not a good idea to single out China in U.S. law, but the policy debate is actually about China. And the reason I feel confident of that is not just the numbers. It's because China is our first security rival, which has enough money to use it as a weapon. All over the world, China uses loans as a political tool. For those following the Belt and Road program that China has announced that it received some recognition from U.S. foreign policy, is basically using loans as a political tool. In that light, it would be a mistake, in my opinion, to spend too much time thinking about the size of the equity stake or what the definition of passive investment is. If China is providing financing to a firm, they have influence over a firm. And we need to be, that doesn't mean that automatically something nefarious is going on. It means we need to realize that Chinese financing brings Chinese influence, just like with any firm. If I'm providing the money, I get a say in what you're doing. And the money trail here is actually evaporating. Total Chinese investment in the U.S. was in the $50 billion range in 2016. This year it is tracking to reach less than 20. It's not going to even hit $20 billion annually. So total investment is falling. 100 million, there have been no $100 million technology investments. We track $100 million investments and up. There have been no $100 million technology investments since January 2017. So it's been well over a year. Now, Beijing hasn't given up on acquiring technology. So the fact that we're not seeing investments in the U.S. is not a sign like, okay, well, problem solved. The problem is obviously not solved, and the administration has told us what their primary concern is. The Section 301 investigation was launched primarily to deal with coercion by China of U.S. firms using access to the Chinese market in order to gain technology. In other words, the primary technology threat is coercing American firms who want access to China. It's not Chinese firms investing here. We know that from the administration's position. We know that from the facts. And that, if China is blocked from an investment here, just as an example, it's a trivially easy thing to do to say, hey, would you like to set up a joint venture in China? Really favorable terms. You're going to make a lot of money. All we need is to get a look at the technology you're using, for our own regulatory purposes. So we cannot locate the action here of Chinese technology acquisition as investment in the United States. Now, the hard part is, what do we do? It's easy for me to identify the problem. What do we do about it? I do work at a free market think tank. The U.S. is by far the largest national player in global investment, both coming into the United States and going out. And what investors love is certainty. So a phrase like country of special concern, that doesn't promote certainty. We need to define high-risk countries, not that they're the only risk countries, but we need to define higher-risk countries in a very clear and concrete way that could be updated over time. And just as an illustration, if we have an arms embargo on a country, that's a higher-risk country. That is a good proxy for high risk. It's not perfect, it needs to be changed, but it's a lot better than saying countries of special concern. Similarly, words like critical, applied to technology, materials, infrastructure, call out for definitions so business knows what to expect from the U.S. review process. Because we want investment, those definitions should be as narrow and as specific as possible. I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. The goal should be that most countries and most firms have nothing to fear from CFIUS reform because it's not aimed at most countries and most firms. My last remark applies to all views of what should be done here. Whatever the final bill looks like, whether it's more interventionist in defense of national security or less, if CFIUS isn't budgeted and staffed properly, it doesn't matter. So I feel like even though we've talked about this, we're not paying enough attention to that issue. In a sense, right, the budgeting and staffing is the most important thing, and then the goals all follow from what you're willing to provide in terms of resources and people. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your testimony, and we will now move into the Q&A portion of the hearing, and I will begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Lowry, how difficult is it for CFIUS to identify transactions which involve a foreign purchase of a U.S. company?
I don't think it's that difficult. I mean, if it's a foreign purchase where there's going to be control, the first thing is just kind of, as we heard in the last panel, there's a process, there's a lot of incentive for the companies to come forward and basically present that to the U.S. government for review under CFIUS. If it's obviously in a non-national security area, they wouldn't do that. But beyond that, the government does spend some of its resources on kind of scouring the M&A press, which is actually a very robust press for a variety of reasons. And so from that, at least, you can basically have the CFIUS actually has subpoena authority, if it needs to go out and actually bring transactions in. So my own view is that you actually capture most of the critical controlling M&A transactions under CFIUS currently. That doesn't mean that it doesn't take some effort, but I think actually most of them are actually brought in through CFIUS.
So would you say that the notice requirements right now are adequate? that are out there already?
I think they're adequate. I actually do think in the FIRMA bill, the addition of having a mandatory requirement for state-owned enterprises is a very good add.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wolf, do export controls create a blacklist of prohibited persons and transactions or a white list of permitted goods and transactions? What's the right approach?
So with respect to individuals, and that's an excellent question because export controls are about controls on information and things, controls on people, end uses. And as was described in the previous panel, there are lists of proscribed individuals and companies to which the export or re-export of anything is prohibited for national security reasons in order to get that threat. So that's the blacklist approach. It goes to the certainty point that was very well made a moment ago in that you have to know who you can't deal with to know who you can't deal with. With respect to the identification of technology, that's done both unilaterally and multilaterally with our regime allies and for companies to know what requires a license when, what information is required to get government permission to release. They have to know what it is. And so it's a very explicit list, a very long list, a commerce control list of the types of technologies and related items that are controlled. To the extent it's sometimes too difficult to describe exactly the term, occasionally there are notes that say particular technologies in these areas are not caught, such as a whitelist. But the primary approach is a positive list approach of identifying the names of the companies and the individuals and the types by technical description or other objective terms, the technologies that require permission to transfer.
Thank you. Dr. Scissors, what role does foreign direct investment play in creating economic growth here in the United States?
Well, the role changes over time. I think
I think just
the role changes over time. I'll ask that question, I think, in a quick fashion, but a very important fashion. The president and a lot of other national and local politicians have said, the U.S. needs to at least partly, to the extent we can, reindustrialize. That there are manufacturing jobs that can and should be created in the U.S. that to some extent have been lost to automation or trade, and we can bring some of them back here. And I think that's true to some extent. It requires foreign investment. We can't do it without that. So if you care, as I do, and I think probably almost everyone in this room does, care about reindustrialization, if you deter foreign investment, you're really striking it's a very difficult task to bring millions of manufacturing jobs to the United States. You can't do it without foreign investment. So that's the way I would say, I would describe it. It's a big question, but foreign investment is crucial to the idea of bringing manufacturing jobs, a large number of manufacturing jobs to the economy.
Thank you. Mr. Lowry, what is the best way to address the question of how to ensure sensitive U.S. technology and information does not fall into foreign hands?
So I think that it's a combination of factors. So one is, I think the most important one, which actually isn't really the U.S. government, it's actually the companies themselves. The companies themselves, they don't want to allow their technology to fall into foreign hands or, by the way, domestic hands, because that is the technology that allows them to make money. And so that is the, quote, secret sauce, unquote. Going beyond that, though, I think the export control regime is probably the best regime we have, and it needs to be updated, and that's why I think Congressman Royce's bill is a very positive bill, and Congressman Engel's bill. And I think that that helps put more force into what they should be doing, the export control regime. I think CFIUS also is very helpful, but it's my own view, is that it should be about what is a foreign investment into this country. And so I think the combination of what the private sector does and then the export control regime and the CFIUS, I think, is the best way to address these issues.
My time has expired, and I recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to explore some things with you, Ms. Drake. Gene Green, I don't know if you were here for the earlier, he raised some questions about labor and about the workforce, and the answers that we heard from Mr. Tarbert at Treasury essentially was, we narrowly focus on national security issues. And I would argue that it really is narrowly defining national security issues. And in some ways, I think you've tried to broaden that. What is a national security issue? And I would certainly like to see, to the extent that jobs are at stake, et cetera, is also part of a national security issue. But you mentioned in your testimony additional shortcomings of CFIUS that are not addressed in FIRMA, FIRMA, including the issue of greenfield investments. And so what are greenfield investments, and why might they present a concern for the United States?
Thanks. So greenfield investments are when you're not buying a going concern. So you might be buying the land and building a factory from scratch. And in theory, you would think, well, this is one of the good kinds of foreign investments that we want, because if you're building a brand new workplace or factory, you're creating jobs that didn't exist before. And that's potentially the case. But in the case, I gave the example in my written testimony and mentioned it briefly, Tianjin, which is a steel pipe producer that's about to open a new facility actually in Texas near Mr. Green's district. And the problem is that if they behave in such a way, if the whole point of the investment is to evade U.S. trade remedy law, whether it's dumping, countervailing duty, Section 232, and then they bring in from their own company, their own suppliers in China, which they own, dumped, subsidized inputs, we're not going to be able to reach those inputs through trade remedy law, and then they're behaving here in a predatory manner that might drive other U.S. competitors out of business. So we could, in the long run, be losing jobs, be harming communities, and potentially driving down wages in that sector if we end up with a monopsony type situation where there are fewer buyers of labor. So these are the kinds of things that we want to look at when we're looking at does foreign investment benefit our economic security, which really is linked. I mean, whether you talk about a net economic benefits test or you just talk about expanding our view of what national security is, if our economy isn't strong, then certainly our national security is at greater risk.
So right now, CFIUS concentrates on this narrow view of national security. And in your testimony, you cited the U.S.-China Commission's recommendation for addition of a, quote, net economic benefits test, unquote. And you see that being under CFIUS or some sort of a new regime that, regimen?
We would put it under CFIUS rather than building a whole new regime. And, Canada does a similar thing. Australia does a similar thing. Those are both popular destinations for foreign investment. So it's not driving away investment. But it's a way to say, let's make sure if you're investing, it's not to strip the know-how and technology and take the jobs elsewhere, but you're committing to having the production here for the long term. You're committing to hiring U.S. workers, to paying good wages. These all really matter, because if it's really predatory and it ends up killing an entire sector of the U.S. economy, those are jobs, but those are in the long run things that we can no longer make, and we've got to rely then on imports from some other source. So these things really should be looked at part and parcel by CFIUS.
And so you think that we have a structure that could add on this whole additional piece? I mean, I think it's a really important piece, and where it gets housed and how it happens. Does the Department of Labor do any of these things now, looking at these investments and how they impact the overall economy and jobs?
Not in that manner. As you heard from Secretary Tarbert on the first panel, the Secretary of Labor sits on CFIUS but is a non-voting member and doesn't really look at these sort of workforce, wage, jobs issues. But it could easily be done, and I think it would be value added to what CFIUS is already doing.
I'd really like to talk to you about that. I think these are matters of national security, and like to work with you and the AFL-CIO on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lowry, when you were at Treasury, the CFIUS process was substantially revised. Obviously, how did did the process change, and does it provide any insight into how policymakers should proceed under the current proposals?
Thank you, sir. So the way it mainly changed, it didn't change what CFIUS was looking at, which I think Mr. Tarbert talked about. What it did was it made a much more formal review process by the intelligence community. So the intelligence community was always part of CFIUS, but it enhanced it. And then it also enhanced the level of accountability from the U.S. government. So it wasn't just signed off on by the career civil servants, not that they don't do a great job, but it basically, the people that have to testify before Congress have to now sign off on all transactions. It also provided a lot more transparency between the executive branch and the congressional branch, which frankly did not exist before that. So all of those were a lot of process issues. There was also some updates on the types of issues we were looking at, especially on critical infrastructure and some homeland security issues, which was an update from a previous era. I would say probably the last thing is but it took a lot of time. So in 2007, we passed FINSA through Congress. It took about 1.5 years to do the regulatory process to get it back up into place, and then you had to make sure you had the right personnel, because everybody has to have the right clearances and so forth to look at this. So it just takes a long time. Some of my criticism of the FIRMA bill, and not all of the FIRMA bill, but parts of it, are that you would take this and metastasize it, and that's the part that I worry about, that we will literally wouldn't be able to implement it.
Yeah, understood. Mr. Wolf, your testimony, you said, and this is interesting to me, that one side of the CFIUS debate are folks that believe transactions are more creative than the government can understand. I'm just curious if you thought that when you were at Commerce.
Yes, in fact, which is why I emphasize.
That's a serious question, but it's also kind of in jest, because
technologies are evolving, transactions are evolving, the world is evolving quickly, and it's in any area of law and regulation, it's difficult for the government regulations and statutes to keep up. And I acknowledge that as a serious debate.
Let me just say, I agree with you. I do think that bureaucracies can get behind pretty quickly.
Right.
And it is. I would just have phrased it in a different way. It's not that the government can't understand it. It's just things are evolving so quickly because of the inherent nature of the way agencies and the government do their business, that's pretty easy for them to quickly get behind. I'm not saying I disagree. I just thought I'd ask you what you thought that when you were at Commerce.
But it's the key philosophical question in this FIRMA debate, which is, if in light of that fact, should you have rather expansive authority with very broad general definitions on inbound and outbound investments in order to be able to know when you see it later whether there's a transaction of concern?
Yeah.
And then the second question is, if that expansive authority does more harm than good with respect to the open investment culture that every president before us has acknowledged.
Yeah.
So I've got a longer version of that, but that's the essential debate in this question.
Yeah, understood, and I don't disagree. I think we need to balance, our ability to accept foreign investment and have, and to make sure that our economy is strong and not inappropriately burdensome, investment by overreaching. That's why we need to strike a balance here. But that said, based on what people like me are currently hearing in the classified setting on a lot of issues, we have some really pretty serious national security issues to address, and that's why getting this right is really important. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And just finishing on that, and I'm not my line of questioning, but that's one of the debates we have as a legislative branch. How much authority do we grant? Because it's quicker to react regulatory than legislatively, and you get broad definitions and broad authorities, and you hope that the things go down the way that Congress intended when you do that. But with the Chevron case, it gets to the point where both sides have and if you're an executive branch, you probably want to do that anyway. It's taking a lot of liberty, I think, with what Congress intended. So unfortunately, we're to the point that we have to be more prescriptive than that, because you can't legislate for who's in power now. You got to legislate for who may be in power in the future. But so this, Mr. Wolf, this is first question to you. One of the reasons cited for the current legislation is the need to deal with emergency situations, such as when a foreign purchaser is actively seeking to acquire U.S. technology. How long does it take for the export control process to work, and is it suited for emergency situations?
And that is the follow-on to my previous point. And the key effort in this debate, which I think is very well laid out in a process point in Section 109 of Congressman Royce's bill, is the need to identify the technologies of concern, the emerging technologies that are being sought by countries of concern, identify and regulate them regardless of the nature of the transaction, whether it's a joint venture, or whether it's a voluntary sale, whether it's a telephone call. If technology is of concern, if it's being sought to be acquired by a foreign government to our detriment, it should be regulated, and that's exactly what the export control system does. Now, to the timing question, so I was so concerned about this when, during my time, we created a process that was referred to earlier, the OY 521 process, that allows the Commerce Department to identify immediately and impose unilateral controls, that is, without needing the permission or coordination of other countries, over any technologies for any foreign policy or national security reason. So the legal answer to your question is it can be done as quickly as a reg can be written and published, which in a day. The harder question, which is where the process point comes in from Secretary Royce or Congressman Royce's bill, is to identify those technologies that historically we're not familiar with. And in this entire debate, artificial intelligence, robotics, driverless vehicle technology, a long list of other technologies are the target of acquisition. And so my primary advocacy is that the government devote significantly more creative resources to identifying those technologies, listing them, and tagging their ability to be released to countries and end users of concern, regardless of whether it's an investment, passive or otherwise. So it can be done quickly, and so the law is there to do it quickly. The hard part is the brain power to think through what really is of concern, and without doing it in such a broad way that you discourage investment in the U.S. or U.S. companies from developing this technology in the U.S.
So the law doesn't prevent you from acting quickly at the process. I mean, doing the right thing correctly is what?
It's a function of will and creativity and intelligence and collective effort.
So you're not to the point where everybody agrees this is right, but we've got to wait so many days because of the law. The law actually allows you to do it.
The existing regulations with the broad authority that Congress has given the Commerce Department exist to tag and identify something immediately. One quick follow-on, however, that shouldn't be where it ends, because the worst export controls are the ones that stay forever unilaterally. That is, only the U.S. imposes, because what that does is it drives that work, that technology, that development to our allies, and then we lose that work because the U.S. is a more restrictive environment than our allies. Okay. And so what I've just described is a short-term unilateral fix, but the regulation and also Congressman Royce's bill lays out a process to make it multilateral so that our allies are in the same boat with us and achieving the common objectives and leveling the playing field with respect to control of the technology of concern.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Lowry, is CFIUS equipped to review not only inbound foreign investment into the U.S., but also outbound transactions, such as the contribution of intellectual property to a joint venture with a foreign entity?
No, it's not. And the original FIRMA bill would provide it that authority, and that is the biggest problem of the bill. It should not be doing that. That is, CFIUS should be about foreign investment into this country, and if it is a concern about what is happening that is being exported, whether it's in a joint venture or whether it's just a regular sale, that's when you turn to the authorities that Kevin Wolf was just talking about. That's what the export control system is all set up to do. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to be modernized, updated, and maybe sometimes having a fire under the you-know-whats from Congress. And I think that that's kind of what I saw from the Congressman Royce and Congressman Engel's bill.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Scissors, can you please touch on the policy motivations for H.R. 4311 that stem from the Made in China 2025 plan?
Sure. One difference in talking about how quickly to move is that, China has a declared intent to acquire technology to attain global technological leadership. It's not just to acquire technology to make its people better off. It's to be the leader ahead of all of you, everyone else, in various sectors. And some of those sectors we might think of, okay, electric cars. We don't want a lot of combustion engines on Chinese streets for 1.4 billion people. But other areas like semiconductors, there's an obvious national security component to that, as well as strategic economic component. So we've had, this Made in China 2025 is not the first time the Chinese have announced an industrial policy. It's the first time they've announced an industrial policy at the high end, where we're going to get technology at the high end. We're going to subsidize our companies at the high end. So the challenge to the United States has changed fundamentally, because China is now competing with us in areas where we thought we were the undisputed global leader, and their intent is explicitly for that no longer to be true, that we will not be the undisputed global leader.
Mr. Drake, you were shaking your head a couple of seconds. Do you have a comment on that then?
Oh, I agree.
You're agreeing. I was gonna say you
absolutely
agree.
with
Yeah.
those comments, and think that we have to adjust what we're doing to respond to what China's doing. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Byron, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. And seeing no other members here to ask questions, first I want to thank you all for being here. Your testimony has been very, very informative. It's an area that, I think that this committee's, delving into, and we've got to do something. So I want to thank you for being here. And before I conclude today, I'd also like to make sure that we submit for the record by unanimous consent a statement from FCC Commissioner Michael O'Reilly. And pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that witnesses submit their response within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. And without objection, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.